All right, welcome to Unit 3. Today we're going to talk about linear functions. Before we get started on a scrap piece of paper, please pause the video and try to figure out these three problems. All right, so if we would like the x-intercept, we're looking for y is 0. If we want the y-intercept, then we want where x is 0. And more importantly from the graph, if we're trying to find the slope, you can count between two of them, rise over run. So if I counted down 4 and over 2, my slope would be -2. You could also do that between any 2 points that hit on the grid lines. All right, so hopefully you have a note packet, and in your note packet you have turned to, at the bottom it says page 2. The first problem is going to try and give us an idea of a type of linear function, but I'll give you a moment to read this to try and understand what is going on. So I've made a picture of myself, very artistic, I know. And the frame to go around it has to have 8 tiles. So what they want you to do is they want you to figure out if you had a picture of size 2 by 2 or 3 by 3, how many of these would you have to do? So I'd like you to try and pause the video and sketch that out. Okay, so if I have a side length of 2, now I would have a 2 by 2 picture frame. And if I counted it up, 2 by 2 would take 12. So I would like you to pause the video, hopefully that clears it, and make a 3 by 3 and a 4 by 4. All right, so besides my exciting artwork, hopefully this makes sense. The 3 by 3 had 16 and the 4 by 4 had 20. As we go through and do these, if you have to pause and rewind it to get the notes down, that is the beauty of some of these videos. Okay, but we could keep doing this over and over again to start to see a pattern. So I'd like you to fill in the chart from this pattern. All right, so you should be on page 3. They're asking me for the rate of change from the table. I would like you to try and find that. If they say write an equation, right now if we're talking about lines, the basic equation we've used is mx plus b, except they're being tricky and they want to know the number of tiles is t and the side length is s. So instead of y equals mx plus b, we can do t equals ms plus b. But I'd like you to try and figure out what is the rate of change, what does that stand for, and how could I figure out the y-intercept? You should be pausing the video. So a lot of last year you had to do linear equations, so this shouldn't look like anything new, or I hope it doesn't. But rate of change, we want the change in y over change in x, or rise over run. So the one thing we have to make sure is we put this correct value on top. So 4 over 1 would be my rate of change. That'll go in as my slope. And it doesn't really make sense to have a picture of size 0, but if I went backwards to 0, what would that go backwards to? And that would represent my y-intercept. So instead of adding 4, we'd subtract 4. And that would give us the equation t equals 4s plus 4. And the last thing on this page of the activity is we need to graph this equation. So right now we need to figure out our scaling on the x and y axis and to label it. Okay, so this tells me to include axes and labels. I don't think we're going to have negative pictures or negative number of frame tiles. So I'm putting the origin in the bottom corner. Make sure you're labeling something about the picture size and then the number of tiles. So we have to figure out if we're going from 0 to 4 and 4 to 20, how many spaces we have for each. We don't need a break for this, but I just said that each one was worth 1. You can label all of them if you want to. You can use a different scale than I do, but as long as they're spaced out evenly, we should be good. And then I spread these out. I said every 4 was worth 1 of those. So if I graph the points going like X and Y from my table, that was up here, onto this, I will then have completed that task. All right, so once you have these graphed, now you can start to see that they form a linear pattern, which means you could take a ruler and connect all of them together. Certain situations, we may want to connect all of the dots. In this one, if they're using whole squares for a picture, we're not going to have values in between 0 and 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, etc. But just make sure we have this labeled, and hopefully you can see the line starting to develop. So we've highlighted a couple words on here. You have to get used to the fact that if they say explain, you have to give me words, and justify means you could give me like a math equation or solving it, but I want you to read each of these and see if you know what they're even asking me to do. All right, so the first question says explain how I could get my equation from the graph. So as soon as you recognize it's linear, you can use the model of mx plus b. If we see the y-intercept, that gives me my b value of the plus 4, and then I could count in between these. You have to be really careful though. Our spaces on the x and y axis aren't the same. So if I went up 4 on the y axis, when I go across 4, that's really only worth 1 value. So that would give me my slope going for rise over run. Just have to remember your order when you do that. So now that we have our equation, we're going to start plugging them in. So this first one, they want me to put S is 23, and to try and figure out how many tiles would the frame need. Okay, so here's my explanation for why I can figure out the equation for this situation. So I found the y-intercept, that's my b value. I count the slope between the points, that's rise over run. You could have written something differently. All right, so in number 7, they want me to plug in 23. So you're more than welcome to type all that into your calculator. And I got 96 tiles. This says to explain my answer. Every time it says explain, I have to use words. Okay. Now, we have to know the difference between the input and the output value. So if they want the picture frame to be 128 tiles, to just review a little bit of algebra, you should try and distribute. If you see parentheses, you should combine like terms on the same side of the equal sign. And then typically you will add or subtract from both sides. And then multiply or divide from both sides. Okay, so I'd like you to try and pause the video and solve for S. Pause the video means pause it. Hopefully you subtracted first and then divided and my picture size would have been 31 tiles. Okay, in this case, my justification can be all the work that I showed. All right, so I want you to try and do the same thing for the last one, number 9. Okay, so there's a couple reasons why we can't have 2 or less in our frame. You could go back to if we had no picture, we'd have 4 tiles. But if I solved this, I would get that my picture is -1/2 or -0.5. And it is not possible to have a negative length. All right, so on our next page, this came off of an old Regents exam. I'd like you to try and read what it is, interpret the graph, and then it says explain why, or it would be appropriate to draw a line through these data points. You should be pausing the video to read this. Okay, so in the problem, it looks like X is cookies eaten and how many calories. All right, and if I counted, I have a consistent slope on this graph. Again, you have to be really careful what each grid is worth. So the X's were worth 1 and the Y's were worth 80. But it says explain why it's appropriate to draw a line through the graph. So if I drew this line, now I'm including values instead of just 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, etc. Now I'm including in between it. So it's possible to not just eat cookies in chunks of 3. So it is possible to eat a different amount than 3 at a time. Okay, and whichever one you had, let's say you had 5 cookies, then you could come up and try and figure out how many calories you would be burning, or you would be eating. Then you'd have to burn them, I guess. All right, so I'm on page 6. And this is asking you to brainstorm anything that you can remember about lines. So this is like a graphic organizer, if you will. You can make bubbles off of this. I'm going to focus mostly on like what does linear mean, what is a function, and then we can branch off of that. So see if you can write anything down that follows that. All right, so if I think about linear, that has the word line in it. Okay, most people say it's a straight line. If it's a line, it should be straight. Our general equation in slope-intercept form looks like that. We will learn one called point slope form. And we'll learn the difference between those. Okay. If we have a slope, we will be using this formula between 2 points for not counting it off of a graph. Then if we talk about being a function, we have to pass the vertical line test. Every input has one output. Every single line is linear unless it is vertical. This would be an x equals some number line. And then finally, if we talk about our slope, we're sloping up and to the right if it's positive, we're sloping down and to the right if it's negative. And the big one is a line has a constant rate of change. That is the main reason that you know something is linear. So pause the video, write a bunch of this down. Okay, so sometimes for slope, they might ask for the average rate of change. It's the same way of asking for the slope. between 2 points. So we could think of the idea rise over run if we were graphing it, which is really the change in y over change in x. That triangle is the Greek letter delta, which stands for change in. Okay, and then this is our formula that we will use. All right, and the idea is you're given some point, and you'll use those two values in your formula, and you're finding the slope to another point, which would give me these two values in my formula. Okay, so these little numbers are called a subscript. They are not squared or to the first power. So a lot of times I will label it. All right, in your calculator you can get a fraction button if you do alpha y equals enter. If your calculator won't do that, I'll like to help you with that. So usually what I do is if it says find the slope, here's my slope formula. I'll label one of the points x1 and y1. The other point will be x2 and y2. Okay, as long as you do it in the same order, you should be okay. So if I start with my y1 and my y2, and I'm subtracting from that y1 and x1. All right, so if I'm using my calculator, I would hit alpha y equals and then enter. And then I can type in all at once. It'll simplify the fraction for me. So 7 minus 3 in the top. You have to hit the down arrow to get in the denominator. And then 2 minus negative 1. Make sure you see the difference between the minus and the negative. If I hit enter, it'll give me that back as a fraction and it'll simplify it for me. Okay, if you do it by hand, that works as well, but usually they'll want that simplified. So I would like you to try the same process with the second one by pausing the video. All right, so I got a final answer of 5. If you did it by hand, you get negative 10 over negative 2. And in all the Regents courses, they're always going to want you to solve or simplify your fraction. All right, this last one is probably going to be the one that you struggle the most with. If they give me the equation and y is not by itself, we want to change this to look like y equals mx plus b. So in order to do that, I will add or subtract the x term. In this case, I would subtract 2x from both sides. And I'd get in the habit of putting whatever x has first, so you know that that's where your slope is. Technically, you could write it as 6 minus 2x if you wanted to. And then second, I'm going to divide by y's coefficient, or whatever number is in front of the y value. And we have to divide each piece by that. Okay, and sometimes it bothers people that we're going to have a fraction. All right, usually we like slope to be a fraction because it's rise over run. So this has a slope of negative 2/3. All right, so the last part of the lesson is to graph these from an equation. So I think it's longer to graph some of these in the calculator. If this looks like mx plus b, I know that my slope is 2 over 1 and my y-intercept is 6. So I'm going to start with going to 6 on the y-axis. And then if I'm going to go to the right, I would go up 2 over 1 and put a point, up 2 over 1 and put a point. If I'm going to go to the left, I'm going to reverse that. So down 2 to the left 1. And as long as I'm showing a constant rate of change, that would be how I graph this line. It's also a good habit to label your line after you have graphed it. Eventually we'll be graphing more than one line where you will need to label it. So on this second one, I would like you to try and rearrange the equation to get it to be y equals mx plus b. Please pause the video and do so. So if I'm following those steps, I'm going to try and move the x term by adding or subtracting it. This time I'm subtracting it since it was positive on the left side. Again, I'd get in the habit of putting the x term first. So I'm keeping the negative with the 5x. It's plus 15 because 15 is positive. And then I'm going to divide everything by 3. And once I get to here, the coefficient of the x is my slope. And the number by itself is my y-intercept. Please pause the video and try and graph this by using those two values. So I started on the y-axis at 5 because it's my y-intercept. And then if I'm going to the right, I went down 5 to the right 3, down 5 to the right 3. And as long as that is constant, that will produce our line. I labeled it with the original. I could have labeled it with this part. But if you need more practice with that, make sure you ask me the next time I'm in class. Okay, so if they give me a word problem, you could convert this to y's and x's. They're saying HR is their test grade, that would be my y value. R is the number of hours the student studies, that would be x. So you could rewrite this as 40 plus 10x if that makes you feel better. So is this function linear? What is the y-intercept? And how many hours do I have to study to get an 85? I would like you to pause and try and do that. So there's a couple different explanations for linear. I would say yes. It is in the form y equals mx plus b. You could say it has a constant rate of change. If they want the y-intercept, this is a little bit backwards because the x came second, but the y-intercept would be 40. So we have to explain what that means in the context of the problem. So y is a test grade after x, how many hours did I study? So you would score a 40 if you study 0 hours. Try not to make the explanations hard. Go back to where they tell you what the letters are so that you know how to write that out. And finally, that's awkward. Finally, I want to know, do I put 85 in for X or Y? So how many hours do they study is what they're asking me. 85 on the test. That would be like my Y or my H of R. And then this is my R. So I'd like you to try and solve this for R or X, whichever one you used. So typically, if we only have one letter in the problem, you want to add or subtract from both sides. I subtracted 40, multiply or divide to get the letter by itself, and to get an 85, you would have to study for 4.5 hours. So the last question is asking us if this is a linear function or not, and then to determine the intercepts. So please study the table and determine if you think it is or is not. All right, so there's a couple different ways they might catch you in this problem. The x values aren't increasing by the same amount, so don't just look at the y values. So I had 2 instances where the x values increased by 2. And make sure if I'm going to do change in y over change in x, you recognize those are the y's and these are the x's. So 4 over 2 would give me a slope of 2. There were 2 instances where x changed by 1. Again, be really careful what's on the top and the bottom. So in green, we changed by 2 over 1, which is also 2. So I would say yes, this is linear. It has a constant rate of change. Or a slope of 2. All right, and then I need the x-intercept and the y-intercept. So if y is 0, that produces my x-intercept. If x is 0, that produces my y-intercept. So if I was writing out the equation of this, I would have 2x minus 2. So now that you've finished the video and I'm become a YouTube legend, please raise your hand and get the homework from the substitute, and I will see you next class.